Welcome to On the Move. First of all, I would like to note that this is the last program, at least for some time. I would definitely like to first thank Medyascope for supporting On the Move to go on for more than 2 years. I learned quite a lot in this process, and I'm really grateful. We now have an amazing archive of 50 programs. And of course, most importantly, many thanks for everyone who continued to listen to us and encouraged me to keep it going. So I started the first program of On the Move with EU's migration policies. And today I will end with the same topic on EU's migration policies. Today we will focus on the past 7 years of the joint declaration between EU and Turkey, the infamous EU-Turkey deal. But also we will discuss the deteriorating migration policies at EU's external borders, more and more characterized by inadequate asylum procedures, returns, detentions, and increasingly militarized border protection regimes, the so-called improved migration management in the EU. And today my guest is my amazing friend and colleague, Minos Mouzourakis. Minos, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Begüm. Thank you very much for having me.
Let me briefly introduce you. Minos is a legal officer at the Refugee Support Aegean, RSA. RSA is a non-profit organization offering legal support to refugees and asylum seekers in Greece. But he has also previously worked at the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, which we know as ECRE, on the Common European Asylum System and its implementation, and has conducted research for the European Parliament, UNHCR, and the University of Oxford. He holds an MSc in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford and law degrees from University College London and University in Marseille. So welcome again, and thank you so much for joining me today. It's really nice to have you at the final program. And without really taking too much of time, let's talk. So last month, RSA argued that the deal is in ruins on both sides of the Aegean, and it simply doesn't work. And it calls for the immediate abolishment of the EU-Turkey agreement and the launch of radically different policies than those what we have as deterrence and militarization of external borders today. So the deal was a short-sighted political attempt to halt the movement of people in the aftermath of 2015, and it wouldn't work, as many of the human rights organizations, could foresee 7 years ago. But indeed, it became a blueprint for the EU. So, how do you see the general human rights impact of the EU's of the deal on the EU's external borders?
First of all, thanks very much again for having me today. Taking this as the last program of a series of extremely well-prepared and very interesting and thought-provoking programs for On the Move. I'll try not to take this as extra pressure, but hopefully we can try to navigate some of the issues on the sustainability and the integrity of not only the EU as a definer of migration policy, but also as a human rights space and as a rule-based legal order. The EU-Turkey deal, I think, becomes, with time, a more controversial and interesting piece of text for one to read. The first thing that we recall looking at the statement that was signed over 7 years ago between Turkey and the leaders of EU countries was that this deal was to entail urgent and temporary measures at the time to respond to a particular situation that was unfolding in the EU after the large-scale arrivals of 2015. Now, 7 years on, we hear consistent accounts of the EU-Turkey deal or statement as the blueprint, as a success story, and as the basis not only for migration policy in the EU overall, but also for its dealings, its relations with third countries. From our perspective, and from the viewpoint of civil society in Greece, of practitioners in Greece, I think the human rights and legal impact overall has been palpable. The EU-Turkey deal has essentially entrenched EU migration policy in perpetual crisis mode, still 7 years on, with completely different realities in the various countries across the European continent. We still work under the assumption that the EU is facing a crisis and that the EU cannot handle the arrival of people seeking protection. Also, in terms of process and in terms of perspective, what the EU-Turkey deal has brought as a destructive legacy for the EU is contempt for principles of rulemaking. The controversy that surrounded the signature and the launch of what officially still remains a statement came with a very clear message. We will not go for a formal agreement with a non-EU country, meaning that we concede that we're circumventing our own institutional rules. I think as an admission on the part of the European Union, that comes as a core rule of law concern from the outset. Essentially, if this is to be the game changer, and if this is to be the model, why could we not follow the basic rules that we have for entering into such agreements? And why, for such a long time, we still concede that we are too constrained by our own human rights culture and rules to actually put forward a policy like this. The substance of the deal, I think, and what it actually brought on the ground in terms of impact on both sides of the Aegean Sea has been one of the most documented and amply commented and scrutinized elements of migration policy. There's been an abundance of research, of positions, of litigation on all different issues. What I always find very interesting to bring, perhaps as a different perspective on the matter, is the ways in which the EU-Turkey deal became a beacon for Eurocentrism in refugee policy. Not only for focusing disproportionately on the Greek side of the application of the deal, even though in terms of numbers, in terms of statistics, and in terms of needs, the Turkish side perhaps warrants more consideration, but also how the EU-Turkey deal has allowed the EU to depart from the factual reality that the overwhelming majority of the refugee population throughout the globe is actually not on the European continent.
Yeah. Before actually focusing more on the Greek-Turkish side, these days we're discussing a lot of things on the media through UK or for other countries, these external measures to be implemented, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to see your take on how that EU-Turkey deal is related or has been actually has an impact on these other negotiations with other parts of the world, because I'm not really well versed on Africa, but I hear that, for example, even beyond North African territories, that EU makes a lot of deals with third countries to stop migration, like they have done with Turkey, and this seems to be highly, accepted within EU by EU leaders.
I think there's always been a degree of continuity and path dependence in how the EU views migration, and there's things we can extract from the evolution of the EU's approach that actually make none of this necessarily a new thing. So it was already 2003, for instance, when EU leaders were discussing extraterritorial processing plans, ideas to have people undergo refugee status determination before they ever reach European territory. And essentially, we've had repeated cycles of new ideas on how to solve, let's say, migration that would entail countries outside the EU, arguably with much more political instability, less financial stability, undertake responsibilities to protect refugees that the EU refuses to undertake, not for want of capacity, but for want of political will. So I think the EU-Turkey deal is situated within that broader framework of a concerted attempt to not have migration in the EU, an insistence on misrepresenting refugee protection as illegal migration, not properly identifying the issue at hand, and trying to have a very much narrowly defined and very often one-sided way of looking at relations with third countries in a completely transactional fashion, which would have the EU covering, let's say, compensating refugee protection in those countries, be it through financial means, through technical equipment, and sometimes through political support, even if tacit, to countries that very often represent authoritarian regimes and depart from democratic principles.
Yeah. So going back to the Greek-Turkish borders to look more closely, then what are the particular issues that you would like to emphasize, not just for the right, on the impact of the EU-Turkey deal, not only on the rights of people on the move, but also on Greek civil society, human rights defenders, humanitarian aid, because I think the EU-Turkey deal, in my opinion, besides all other issues of migration control, had an impact on how migration in general is treated for citizens, non-citizens, people on the move, and so on.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the EU-Turkey deal has undoubtedly completely shifted the Greek asylum system. And the way in which Greece viewed and approached migration policy has been problematic for quite some time. There's chronic deficiencies that we still grapple with today. That being said, what the deal brought as a legacy has many facets, ranging from, again, sort of substance issues, with a very clear example on normalizing containment, normalizing encampment. That's not something that we had necessarily seen before, at least in the Greek context, and which at the moment informs the way in which the entire country is geared towards receiving refugees and migrants. The idea is that people should not live in communities, should not have contact with the local host society, and should be confined in large-scale, sort of high-tech infrastructure, very often militarized areas, for their own safety and for the safety of the communities. I think that's a position and a statement that keeps getting more entrenched with time through the initial encouragement that was brought by the EU-Turkey deal. Yeah. A second line, let's say, of consequences that is quite interesting to unpack, perhaps, is the level of intrusion, often micromanagement, on the part of the EU executive in key political decisions at the Greek level, which very often regulated sort of excruciating details of the actual process of how asylum applications would be processed, where people would be housed, and so forth, and which has led also to perpetual legislative reform of the Greek asylum framework with a view to limiting rights. Yeah. The idea was that the intended result of the EU-Turkey deal was for people who had made it to Greece to return to Turkey, and then the means would justify the ends. Our legal system and our entire administrative state apparatus on refugee protection would be geared towards ensuring that we have people to return.
Yeah. Yeah. But in terms of looking at, you've mentioned a lot of documented human rights violations at the, at the Turkish-Greek borders. I've spent quite a few programs actually looking at the pushbacks at the borders, the camps in Samos, Kos, Leros, in Lesvos, with many journalists who have done quite interesting investigative work in these areas. So could we maybe flesh out some of the also other human rights violations that are resulting from, I don't know if can we actually even can we blame EU-Turkey deal for these human rights violations? I don't know, but it's because it's happened in the aftermath and it's ongoing in much more securitized ways. It's, I don't know if it's due to the EU-Turkey deal, but I'm interested in hearing what you think.
I think there's things that certainly emanate directly from the EU-Turkey deal. I mean, the perfect example in this sense would definitely be the way in which Greece has established a lower rate asylum process just for the Eastern Aegean Islands, which, as we know by now, are the sort of geographical confines of the application of the EU-Turkey deal, and has systematically applied a presumption of safety of Turkey as a country where people could return. Mm-hmm. Initially, until 2021, this was a concept, the so-called safer country concept, which applied only to Syrian refugees as a matter of Greek policy. Interestingly enough, the EU preference was for this to be applied across the board, but Greek authorities took the decision to only apply this to people from Syria who fall under a different type of status in Turkey. This is something that very much started with the EU-Turkey deal. It didn't exist before, so I think we could, let's say, attribute it directly to the effects of the deal. I think other issues, including substandard, if not inhuman, living conditions for refugees, denial of access to key services and rights, on the camps, on the island camps and elsewhere, definitely deteriorated as a matter of stretched capacity and chronic failure to invest in appropriate conditions, also as perhaps a matter of deterrence and a matter of messaging towards potential arrivals. These are things that definitely escalated because Greece came under a much different spotlight post-EU-Turkey deal, but for sure pre-exist. Meaning that if one looks back at 2009, 2010, and also at the very powerful rulings from European courts explaining that basic human rights are not guaranteed in Greece for asylum seekers, I think that still very much informs a lot of the discussions on living conditions in the country. It's something that is, again, to me, very much a chronic and a systemic deficiency. I would probably say the same for pushbacks, even though 2020 onwards, we've seen an undeniable expansion and intensification of the practice. I think the pushbacks policy, which has been described by UN special procedures as a de facto country policy, definitely is at a completely different level now than what it used to be a couple of years back. Then again, even prior to the EU-Turkey deal, these practices were still there.
Yeah,
both
no, I was
at the border and also in the Aegean.
Yeah, because I remember in 2013, Amnesty already had reports published on the pushbacks at the Aegean. This was one of the major campaigns that human rights organizations were running prior to 2015. So we keep bringing that up, that, you know, pushbacks are not new, actually.
Sure, exactly. And they've been normalized, I think, in so many parts of the continent and beyond, for a specific segment of the political apparatus and also for public opinion. And Greece research and documentation dates back to also 2007, 2008, with Poisson reports looking at the Aegean and looking at Evros. So I think if we sort of boil it down to actual practice, it actually kind of never went away. Mm-hmm. There might have been a bit of a change of practice as far as the Hellenic Coast Guard is concerned on the islands and in the Aegean Sea more broadly, but pushbacks, regrettably, have always been an unseen part of Greek practice, which I think probably explains why it's also so hard to counter, because it's absolutely clear that this happens in secret against all possible evidence and against positions, reports from all reputable human rights monitoring bodies at the UN level, the EU level, the Council of Europe level. It's still there, right? And there's still a big chunk of government that very much believes this is necessary, which again, sort of circle back to the circumvention of our own rules and values, right? If we believe that it is necessary for us to depart from our own basic standards for dignified life and for respect of human value, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with how we shape our policy, right?
Yeah. And this is what I think the essence of what kind of bothers me to the most, that disregarding the rule of law and how it has become so normalized, not just within the Greek society, but at EU at large, that this is the normalized practice at the moment. So it is very frustrating. When you look at in the last couple of years, when you look at some of the statements by the EU-Turkey deal's architects, the so-called architects, they still claim that there was some virtue in the EU-Turkey deal, and it could have worked. So was there anything really applicable and positive about the EU deal, and why didn't it still not work? Or was it all just, from start to end was kind of a human rights violations on its own as a totality?
I think there's a lot to be unpacked here. So I think it's always super interesting to go back to the deal. And fun fact, I did this morning because I was like, let's just read this whole thing again. What exactly did the deal say? Because there are multiple commitments there, of course. Yeah. It's well beyond return of irregular migrants back to Turkey or resettlement of Syrian refugees by the EU from Turkey. There's a long list of different types of commitments. Many of them taken individually probably make a lot of sense. I mean, you look at the commitment to launch the humanitarian action scheme, which was also an aspect that made an appearance pre-EU-Turkey deal, right? So already in November 2015, there was a discussion on ensuring that people could lawfully enter EU countries from Turkey. That would be a fantastic thing if it could happen. And I think undeniably, the world needs more responsibility sharing. This would not only be good for Turkey as the largest refugee hosting country at the time, but also for the, again, integrity and the sustainability of refugee protection overall. My issue is not necessarily with the textual, let's say, presentation of some of those commitments, but with what is not necessarily in the statement. What was the overall political motivation between the EU leaders and the Turkish government in drawing up the deal? And I think 7 years of experience have for sure shown us that it was clearly about stopping arrivals and, again, conveying that symbolic message that people who would make it to Europe would find the worst treatment possible and no right to stay. The rest of it probably didn't necessarily matter because, again, when you look at that voluntary humanitarian action plan, this was to be triggered if arrivals would go down. And here we enter into a very interesting conversation about our factual basis and our factual reality. The EU will tell you that the EU-Turkey deal has been massively successful in lowering arrivals by 97, 99%. I can never remember what the exact percentage is. What the commitment was if arrivals go down, then member states would voluntarily take people from Turkey. Did that happen? Not really, right? The one-for-one resettlement scheme happened, albeit at sort of a lower pace, although not necessarily as a complete quid pro quo. But the idea that the EU would actually take its own share, as it should, by making sure that the largest refugee hosting country is assisted through actual relocation, resettlement of people, that didn't happen. So,
and instead, on the Migration B Pact, we see not solidarity over responsibility sharing over resettlement, but returns and detention. And so I mean, it's exactly the opposite actually is happening at the moment, right?
Indeed, and I think the
political activist perspective to look at it.
You're absolutely right. And I think one thing that is, again, probably difficult for ourselves to be able to discern, because we never actually make it to the internal council meetings, we never actually properly comprehend firsthand how difficult and at times how toxic those discussions have become between different member states. The reality, at least in my eyes, remains that this is the only thing member states can agree on. It's the only area where any sort of political convergence is possible. And for the EU, very often, the existence of an agreement between states is necessary, no matter what the content. And it's no surprise, again, in the historical development of the Common European Asylum System from the end of the 90s till present, that whenever it's been impossible for member states to agree internally on how to manage refugee arrivals and refugee protection, rather to agree to have more deterrence and more responsibility shifting. Because any interior minister that has to go back to their perceived constituency and deliver a positive message for the narrowly defined national interest will always earn points if they say they've agreed to have less people coming in.
Yeah. Every time I'm regularly reminded that actually what we think is like completely new or increased and violent is it has been there all the time, one way or another. So this is actually a really good reminder to see that this is a very historical, even maybe, you know, from colonial past, a position of Europe and how it relates to the rest of the world in a sense.
Absolutely. And I think there are multiple very, very heavily grounded assumptions in political discourse, at least I think from the center-right side of the table, that either go completely unchallenged or can never be properly debunked because there's no way to overcome those fixations. The easiest examples come from, again, an assumption, an almost axiomatic thought on the part of certain politicians that every person in the African continent or the Asian continent has made it their life's mission to come to Europe, that Europe is the destination for everybody, and that every person who migrates ultimately wants to make it to Europe. Sometimes this comes with a sub-thought of identifying also the specific countries. So it could be Germany, it could be France, depending on who you ask, right? You ask a Hungarian politician, they will say everybody dreams of coming to Hungary. So it really depends. But again, that's something that has been demonstrated to be fundamentally unfounded and wrong through empirical research, through detailed analysis, but it doesn't really matter, does it? Because political discourse doesn't need to be based on facts. The second, and my personal pet peeve, is the pull factor. Anything can be a pull factor if you're brave enough. So you have serious political discussions, very often legal reforms in countries that will use the pull factor argument for literally anything. You might have arguments in French policy that will say, I will withdraw automatic suspensive effect from asylum appeals against certain types of decisions because the opposite is a pull factor, meaning the first person that comes out of South Sudan fleeing conflict will actually look at whether their appeal is going to be automatically suspensive if they end up in a French procedure. And this is how they will make a life-changing decision to go to France. Again, this has been proven not to have absolutely any basis. And yet it's the words in the lips of most people that develop and define migration policy.
Yeah, no, I mean, this reminds me in an interesting way that I was teaching a class this weekend on advocacy on migration and human rights. And we looked at some of the Frontex maps and how they use the arrows, like from Africa, from the Middle East, and all across from the world. And all the arrows show Europe with as if people are not stopping on the way or just flying over the continents, you know? And it's these thick threatening. Of course, it has all these propaganda maps in the background to, you know, trigger certain emotions in the people that view. But this whole idea is that the only destination in the world, I mean, even America and Canada's are out of question in this sense, because even the map is in the center and Europe is in that Eurocentric frame, as we know. So it's actually constantly, this is also not just political rhetoric that's been discussed in the meetings or that has caused the production of some documents, but it is the actual imagination that is pushed to, the public as well, as an image, as a framing the debate.
Indeed. And again, I think the benefit for this, for the EU leadership in this sense, and I would again single out Council and perhaps Commission, because that is usually where most of political and negotiating power lies, is that because this is a discussion that is carried between peers, it's unchecked. There's no contestation of the value or even the reality of those positions. And there's at least then common ground, even if imagined common ground, for a problem to be tackled and a problem to be solved. And if the solution proposed would have means of ensuring that people don't come or that are returned if they come, and kind of instrumentalizing the rest of the process to fit those boxes, perverting very often the nature of refugee protection to deliver those objectives, I can imagine that there's not a single government minister that's not going to be happy about this. The more crucial part is, even if you go down that route, and again, the EU-Turkey deal being a very good example, when you are called to actually evaluate the results, why would you not have a proper analysis and understanding of what went wrong and what didn't? Meaning, let's stop for a minute and take the EU-Turkey deal for what it is. Let's put ourselves into the shoes of, as you said, the architects or the main implementers, and say we actually wanted to deliver those types of results. Did we succeed in delivering them? Yeah. If one reads again the EU-Turkey deal, it's quite clear that probably nothing really worked. I mean, the disbursement of financial assistance to Turkey did happen. Then again, when one has to exactly assess how the money has been used, where it has been invested, this needs a bit of research that may or may not have been done. But for most commitments, we actually don't have the results to show. We don't have anything to deliver. And this is where, again, it becomes more of an issue of optics for the EU to be able to justify that this was successful. Meaning, we committed to returning every irregular arrival from Turkey to Greece. That really didn't happen. I think the numbers speak for themselves, even if a little bit inflated. I mean, if you actually go back to the return figures for Greek islands to Turkey, it's probably higher than what it should be. But this is not considered a failure or kind of deficient implementation. We still talk about a successful implementation because arrivals reduced. But then again, the EU-Turkey deal committed to completely stopping them. So even from a different type of political perspective, if I wanted the deal itself to be implemented, I would be quite unhappy, to be honest with you.
Yeah. No, I want to come back to what you've already kind of started talking about, this whole safe third country concept. I know you work a lot on that. But a lot of people, probably not all my audiences, are familiar with this concept. So what is it at EU scale, and why it actually risks, let's say, mass rejections of people who are actually entitled to protection in Europe?
So the safe third country concept is another one of those obscure creatures that very much predate the EU-Turkey deal and the recent iterations of migration policy. It's made its appearance around the 80s in different European countries and has been in the architecture of the EU's asylum system, in the EU legal framework for quite some time now. The idea behind the safe third country concept is not an admission, a position that somebody is not a refugee. It's more a denial of responsibility to protect them. Meaning that a country would use the concept to actually refuse even examining an asylum claim and to return or transfer a person somewhere else to be processed and protected. The idea is therefore, at its core, purely political. We don't take a position on whether somebody deserves protection from the ubiquitous and sort of internationally agreed refugee regime that is the 1951 Refugee Convention. We rather say that person is not my responsibility. it has to be somebody else's. So already from the outset, this hinges on a destination country actually being available to take that person, right? If this is only a unilateral process, you deny protection to the person and they have nowhere to go. This is what is traditionally called in literature and policy as the refugees in orbit problem, or in more understandable lingo, the ping pong game. Not my problem, it's Begüm's problem. Not your problem, it's somebody else's problem. And of course, human lives are involved. People have to go somewhere. They cannot go back to their persecutor. They have to be protected by somebody. So this is where we start, right? And because this is geared towards responsibility shifting, meaning a way for countries to get out of their own obligations and responsibilities, it is already problematic from the outset. There has been, again, ample research and ample legal analysis on whether the concept even stands in the architecture and the overall structure of the refugee regime. Because if one thinks of it, this contradicts the very commitment to protect refugees, right? So there have been more tempered positions, including the position that is taken, for instance, by the UN Refugee Agency, which would suggest that transfer arrangements could be acceptable if there's a clear framework and if people have a reason to go to a different country. If they have particular connections with a country that would actually make it more sensible for them to be protected there instead of here. But I think politically speaking, there's no solidarity, there's no responsibility sharing objective behind this. It's more, again, the narrowly defined national interest of not in my backyard. Yeah. And that is actually exactly how EU countries have implemented the concept in practice. For the EU-Turkey deal, this was the main legal tool that was provided to Greece, even though legally speaking, it pre-existed the deal, to be able to deny protection to people who undeniably need protection. Yeah. Because again, safer country won't mean that the person's not a refugee. It might mean the person is 100% in need of protection, but they could get that protection somewhere else. So you don't even have to get into the awkward situation of assessing whether you're denying asylum to somebody that would be in need thereof. You just don't need to engage in that conversation at all. Of course, that comes with certain safeguards and certain rules. So the EU system, the EU legal order, has a number of criteria for being able to determine that a country is a safer country. It cannot be any place in the world. There has to be certain safety considerations that are taken into account, and what we also refer to as connection criteria, meaning that there has to be some sort of valid reason for the person to return back or to go to a certain country. That cannot be something that is completely blanket or sort of abstract. Now, if one compares Turkey to, let's say, the current discussions that the UK is starting with Rwanda, you already have some differences, meaning that Rwanda is a very random geographical location for a Syrian refugee to go to after they've reached the UK. It's also a long trip, but I think there's obvious connection criteria that come up even if the safety considerations are resolved. For Turkey, however, whatever connection criterion was put forward was again completely sort of shoehorned into the equation of we have to return refugees to Turkey. So the reasoning that was provided politically and incorporated legally in the application of the Greek asylum system was transit through the country has to count for something. If you pass through a country, that might mean some sort of connection. Spoiler alert, usually it doesn't. It's just a country that you transit through in order to reach safety. And very often people spend a matter of days in a country before they're able to flee further. The second line of reasoning was geographical proximity. So Turkey, for instance, is a country that is geographically neighboring Syria. So this would be a reason for Turkey to be a more reasonable location because it's closer to the country of origin, there might be affinity, it's easier for a person to return, etc. All of this is quite generalized, of course. There's no assessment in this that actually looks at where the individual refugee would be better protected, which shows that, again, this is a political arrangement that is based upon, that is grounded upon, not looking at individual claims, at denying even an individual examination. All of this, notwithstanding the very serious safety considerations that come into play. And there again, these are things that have been not only researched in quite a bit of detail when it comes to the level of compliance with human rights that the Turkish asylum system guarantees, but also with official documentation from EU institutions themselves. I always find it extremely interesting to read the Commission's own reports on the Turkish rule of law and asylum system, and to juxtapose this to the EU's approach to whether the safe third country concept could be applied vis-a-vis Turkey. I usually find very stark contradictions between the two Commission talking heads, let's say, the two bases that the same institution has, yes, and could conclude that even when the evidence is presented in Greece, it's never taken into consideration. There are different levels where those arguments could be brought forward. One could be the legislative designation of Turkey as a safe third country, because Greece now has a legal presumption in our secondary legislation that Turkey is safe for Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, and others. Already at that point, Greece, as any other country, would be obligated to assess what the conditions are and to look at authoritative reports to be able to draw those conclusions. Even when we bring those reports to their attention, they're not taken into consideration at all. And the same type of approach is followed in litigation. So in the individual handling of cases, the evidence that is brought to dispel the safety of that country is not taken into consideration either.
Yeah, one of the questions that I don't have an answer, maybe I didn't research enough, is because the safe third country concept also requires, I assume, that these people have access to international protection in the third country, right? Yes. But Turkey, having a geographical restriction on non-EU Council citizens to apply for refugee status, let's say the temporary protection they assume as a protection, but for Afghans and other nationals, Turkey does indeed have some secondary protection measures, but actually they cannot receive a refugee status in Turkey. So I'm still Turkey mixing, but so in that sense, how actually is legitimized to consider Turkey as a safe country, because there is no access for Afghan nationals to seek asylum. Let alone the reports of human rights violations they experience or the limits to ECRE and so on. ECRE.
I think this is already where you can essentially see the EU system cutting corners. So the safe third country concept is essentially built on the foundation of denying responsibility for refugees and shifting it to countries which will, in most cases, not necessarily offer the same level of protection. So already, if one looks at it from the global perspective of the need to protect refugees, we already have a problem, because we already have a continent with a very prescriptive, developed, sometimes excruciatingly detailed asylum system, accepting that it would be legitimate to send people to a country that does not even offer that level of protection. There were very lengthy legal discussions on whether the safe third country concept, as elaborated in the EU legal order, would require the third country to have ratified and to apply the Refugee Convention, or whether a lower level of a system could actually work. The position that is taken by both the European Commission, but also by the Greek government and the Greek courts, is that that's not necessary. That essentially a lower rate of protection would still be enough for an EU country with higher standards to deny responsibility and to have the person go to a country with lower standards. In Greece, this has been litigated quite controversially still to date, both for the temporary protection status that Syrian refugees would get under the Turkish system, and also for the so-called conditional refugee status that people would get under the Turkish law on foreigners and international protection. The latest decision that came out of the highest court of the land, the Greek Council of State, in February of this year, includes a mention of this part as well. The case concerned, among others, Afghan refugees and the level of protection they would be able to get in Turkey. And the position of the Greek judges was that even though this is not up to par with the Refugee Convention, it would still be good enough. What I think you raise, however, brings up two more questions that are absolutely crucial. Accessing asylum and accessing protection, first and foremost, means accessing a registration process and an asylum procedure, right? Being able to lodge a claim.
Which is the most difficult issue in Turkey at the moment, yeah.
And again, which is amply documented, not even through accounts of practice, let's say, but even through official statements of policy, right? One of the things we've been trying to explain to Greek decision makers over the past year is the 25% rule that has been instituted throughout the Turkish territory, which means that provinces with a high concentration of a foreigner population are closed to new foreigners. So this is not NGOs, journalists, or other ostensibly, non-credible actors coming up with some sort of account. This is an official policy of the country. So this would probably have to be taken into consideration. The second aspect, which has been the pinnacle, I think, of the controversy of the EU-Turkey deal in its implementation for the past 3 years, is that in order to be protected in the third country, you probably need to be able to enter the third country in the first place. The country needs to accept, readmit, or admit you as a presumptive refugee and then hear the claim and examine it. It's again quite clear and undisputed that the Turkish authorities are not accepting any returns. We already knew that the EU-Turkey readmission agreement that was signed in 2014 has never been applied by the Turkish side as far as non-Turkish nationals are concerned. So that's one part out of the window. The pre-existing Greek-Turkish bilateral protocol for readmission has been suspended for now 5 years. So again, that's also not applied. And the EU-Turkey deal, which should not be considered as a distinct basis for readmissions, but then again, what have you, has not been applied since 2020. There was a whole discussion, as you recall it, around the COVID pandemic and this being a temporary circumstance that would be lifted anytime soon. We don't operate under COVID restrictions anymore, it's quite clear. Returns are still not happening. And actually, the Turkish government has communicated officially that this has nothing to do with COVID anyway. So there has been an official position.
That's what I wanted to ask. If among all these documents, have you seen anything that Turkey responds to the safe third country narrative about Turkey?
So there's an interesting bit of information in a passage of the latest annual report the Commission published on the facility for refugees in Turkey. These are the annual reports that are put forward by the Commission to essentially explain how EU money is spent in improving conditions for mostly Syrian, but not only, refugees in Turkey. The latest one was published about a year ago in May 2022. It again confirms the accounts of what we've known already, that no readmissions are accepted by Turkish authorities. And it actually spells out explicitly that the Turkish government has refused any returns from Greece so long as Greece lists Turkey as a safe third country in Greek legislation and does pushbacks. So unless and until those two things stop, Turkey has said officially that it's not going to accept any returns.
But then Turkey says that you cannot say that Turkey is a safe third country.
The way I read it is Turkey takes issue at least with the official designation in a Greek legislative act, let's say. Okay. I think that far we could definitely go. And the admission of pushbacks, I think, kind of speaks for itself. Yeah. So, of course, these are things that are not necessarily accepted from the Greek side. Even the assumption that this is only a temporary COVID-related suspension is very much maintained by Greece even to this date. Okay. So the view is that this only relates to the pandemic and that returns could restart at any point. I think it's quite clear and understandable from all sides that this is a political negotiation that revolves also around issues that go well beyond migration. So the Turkish position could perhaps shift in the future, but it's quite powerful to have this in writing on paper.
Yeah, it's very, in my opinion, it's very unlikely that that Turkish position is going to change, and even it might even, I think, worsen. So within that pessimism I have, and with the last few minutes we have, I want to ask you the final question is, as there has been a lot of discussion in the past few years to revise the deal, even there's a discussion of volume 2 and so forth. But in the light of the developments with the Migration Pact, my sense of migration policies in the future of Europe are quite dark and worrisome. So how do you see the future of the deal? And from that perspective, especially as RSA last month also called for kind of an advocacy for radically different policies for the future. So what are these radically different policies that we could have some hope for and advocate for? And there we close after that.
That's a big question, but probably the most important one, right? And I think when we speak about radically different policies, one might bring to mind idealistic, completely off the bat ideas on how to revamp an asylum system, but actually a different way and a different approach is already here. Sometimes we don't stress this enough in our conversations, but amidst all the toxicity surrounding deterrence, EU-Turkey deal, returns to third countries, the EU has protected 5 million refugees from Ukraine in the space of a year. This is a tremendous development for the Common European Asylum System, including for countries that have been some of the most vehement supporters of Fortress Europe and externalization. So, characteristics of refugees aside, we already have a blueprint for something that actually works. Large numbers of people in need of protection that don't get crisis treatment, no meltdown of EU systems in the face of a need of a population for shelter and safety, essentially, safe access, lawful, safe means to arrive on European soil, claim protection, and get it quickly, and a realistic, pragmatic approach to responsibility sharing that is flexible and looks at people. We've actually done all of this, right? This is the legacy of the past year. And I think for all the different issues that have arisen in implementation, and for sure there are many, it's still to me a successful example of how to protect refugees. So the question is, since we know we can do it, and since we can deal with even millions of people in need of protection, what do? Right? The pact to me is neither a pact nor a new pact. This reform is actually a regurgitation, it's a repetition of many past mistakes and a codification of some of the worst facets of policy over the past years. If you look at it in comparison to where we have at the moment, it's without any doubt a regression on very, very hard-fought standards over the past 20 years. It took a long time And it took a lot of effort for EU countries and EU institutions to build a common European asylum system. And if we agree the pact, we actually go back. To me, that's a very, very powerful message that keeps getting overlooked in discussions. Whatever this is presented as, and however we communicate this, we don't improve standards in any way. We reduce standards that we already have. So our message from the RSA side, and hopefully more broadly from the civil society side, is actually quite simple. This reform is not the right reform. So this needs to be abandoned. There's no gain to be offered by agreeing on something that's just bad from the outset. We have rules already in place. The EU does not operate in a vacuum. There's already a very intricate asylum system with many imperfections. We need to comply with the rules that we have and with the standards that should inform them, human rights, rule of law, and so forth. And we need to enforce them. So this means when countries don't do the job, there need to be consequences. And we have the tools, we know what we have to do, but the institutions that are in charge of enforcing, and that's mainly the European Commission, are still caught in a very, very self-defeating, I think, approach of not going after violations and assuming that changing the law will make non-compliant states love the law, which I think won't work.
Thank you so much. Is there any other things that you want to add in a second, or is there anything else you want to add?
Only to thank you for being such an amazing host and for having me today.
No, I really appreciate it. This was a really well articulated clarification on the issue. And I think, we've been over talking about what EU-Turkey deal is for the last 5 years, but this has been a really well overview and critical analysis of the issue. And I hope next year we'll be talking about something else. But till then, I guess we'll do what we do the best. And what else can we do? I don't know. In the meantime,
we keep on going, and we stay optimistic. Indeed.
Yeah. Well, I'll at least try that. Yes. So thank you so much again. And again, I would like to thank everyone who watched On the Move for the last 2.5 years. I really appreciate everyone's feedback and continued efforts to watch the program. So thank you, everyone. And I'll be around. I'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.